Millstone, Illinois, a city once defined by trust and tranquility, slowly became a place of unease. The peace was shattered not by a single event, but by a series of unexplained disappearances. No evidence, no witnesses, no bodies. Just people vanishing as if erased. Fear crept in, changing the city's character. Neighbors grew suspicious, laughter faded, and doors locked tight. Millstone's silence became more terrifying than any scream. The missing came from every walk of life, no pattern, no connection. For years, police treated each case as an isolated tragedy until a chilling detail emerged. Every disappearance coincided with a brief, perfectly timed surveillance camera failure. The evidence pointed to a single, methodical predator, someone who could manipulate the city's security systems. The realization sent shockwaves through law enforcement. They weren't just searching for a criminal, they were hunting a ghost in the machine. The media dubbed the culprit the Shadow Collector, a name that captured the city's growing dread. Investigators obsessed over maps, camera grids, and dead zones, but every lead dissolved into silence. The killer left no trace, no DNA, no fingerprints, just vanished lives and digital blind spots. The city's own surveillance, meant for safety, had become a weapon. Millstone's sense of security was gone, replaced by the fear of being watched and chosen. The nightmare began with Rachel Mendez, a beloved teacher and habitual morning runner. One June morning, she vanished without a trace, her routine broken, her absence unexplainable. Calls went unanswered, panic set in as her family realized something was terribly wrong. Police searched her usual route but found only questions. Rachel's disappearance marked the first chapter in Millstone's darkest story. Rachel's smartwatch and phone data ended abruptly at a single point on her running trail. A nearby surveillance camera failed for 4 minutes, just long enough for her to disappear. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. Investigators were left with a chilling question: what happened in that 60-second void? The vanishing point became the symbol of a new kind of terror, one that left only silence behind. In the days and weeks that followed, the Green Creek Trail and its surrounding woods became the site of one of the largest search operations in Millstone's history. Uniformed officers, trained search and rescue teams, and dozens of civilian volunteers formed long lines combing every inch of the park. They waded through the shallow creek, peered into dense thickets of undergrowth, and marked off grids with brightly colored tape. K-9 units sniffed through the damp earth, their handlers calling out Rachel's name into the unnervingly quiet forest. The search was methodical, exhaustive, and ultimately, heartbreakingly fruitless. The woods that had been Rachel's place of peace offered no answers. The complete absence of physical evidence was baffling. Searchers found no signs of a struggle, no disturbed soil, no broken branches, no scuff marks on the trail. They found no discarded items, no dropped keys, no stray fibers from her clothing. Cadaver dogs, trained to detect the scent of human remains, gave no indication of a body hidden nearby. Forensic teams swept the area where her signal was lost, hoping to find a trace of blood or a single hair, but they came up empty. It was as if she had been lifted into the air, leaving no impression on the world below. The silence of the forest mirrored the silence of the case file. For Rachel's family, the lack of information was a unique form of agony. They clung to the hope that she was alive, perhaps taken for reasons they couldn't fathom, but the void of evidence offered nothing to support any theory. The community rallied around them, holding candlelight vigils and plastering missing posters on every lamppost and storefront window. Rachel's smiling face became a ubiquitous, haunting presence throughout the city. But the vigils ended, the posters faded in the sun, and the news cycle moved on. The case of Rachel Mendez went cold, filed away as a tragic anomaly, an unsolvable puzzle that left a permanent scar on the community's sense of security. What no one in Millstone could possibly comprehend was that the search was looking for the wrong thing. They were looking for clues left behind, for evidence of a crime. They didn't know they were dealing with a perpetrator whose goal was the opposite, to leave nothing. Somewhere, in a dark room far from the search parties and grieving family, someone was watching the evidence. Not the lack of it, but the real evidence, the footage. The 4 minutes of missing camera feed were not missing at all. They had been captured, stolen, and saved. The shadow collector was not just an abductor, he was a curator. And Rachel Mendez was his first, perfect acquisition. The chilling quiet that followed Rachel Mendez's vanishing in 2014 was eventually broken. Over the next 2 years, the nightmare repeated itself. By 2016, 3 more people had been erased from the fabric of Millstone. First, it was Marcus Thorne, a 58-year-old widower who disappeared while fishing at a secluded spot by the river. Then came Sarah Jenkins, a 19-year-old community college student who vanished from a bus stop late one evening. Finally, Daniel Miller, a 42-year-old night watchman, failed to return home from his shift at an industrial park. The victims remained as disconnected as ever, their lives intersecting only in the shared tragedy of their sudden, inexplicable absence. The city's initial hope that Rachel's case was an isolated incident crumbled, replaced by a growing certainty that a predator was methodically hunting among them. With each new disappearance, the Millstone Police Department grew more desperate. The case files thickened, but the pages were filled with dead ends and unanswered questions. The pressure from the public and the media was immense, and the department's inability to provide any answers created a sense of institutional failure. Detectives re-interviewed families and friends, re-examined timelines, and re-walked the last known steps of each victim, but the outcome was always the same. A trail that went cold at a precise, unexplainable moment. The randomness of the victims, their different ages, lifestyles, and locations, continued to muddy the waters, making it impossible to build a coherent profile of who might be next, or why they were being chosen. The city was trapped in a cycle of fear, mourning, and frustration. It was during the investigation into Daniel Miller's disappearance that the pattern became undeniable. A junior detective, reviewing the files late one night, noted the detail that had been dismissed as a coincidence in Rachel Mendez's case. He cross-referenced the maintenance logs for public and private cameras near the locations where all 4 victims had last been seen. The result was a cold spike of dread. In every single case, a key camera had failed. For Marcus Thorne, it was a wildlife camera near the riverbank. For Sarah Jenkins, a security camera on a storefront across from the bus stop. And for Daniel Miller, a perimeter camera at the industrial park. Each malfunction was brief, lasting only a few minutes, perfectly timed to create a pocket of invisibility. This confirmation transformed the investigation. The task force, now officially assembled to handle what was clearly a serial case, shifted its entire focus. They were no longer just searching for a person, they were hunting an expert in evasion. The killer wasn't just lucky, he was a meticulous planner who understood the city's surveillance infrastructure better than the people who maintained it. He was deliberately creating digital shadows and using them as his hunting ground. The string of bad luck was, in fact, a string of perfectly executed crimes. The police were facing an adversary who could manipulate their own tools against them, a ghost who controlled the very machines meant to make him visible. The revelation of the sabotaged cameras added a terrifying new dimension to the predator the media had dubbed the Shadow Collector. It suggested a level of sophistication that went far beyond brute force. This killer was not an opportunist who struck in the heat of the moment. He was a patient, calculating strategist who planned his attacks with chilling precision. The task force began to work under the assumption that their suspect had a background in electronics, security systems, or IT. They started compiling lists of current and former employees of the city's public works department, as well as private security firms that had contracts to install or maintain surveillance equipment throughout Millstone. The list was long, and with no other evidence, it was a daunting and slow-moving process of interviews and background checks. Investigators also began to dig deeper into the digital lives of the victims, searching for any common thread that might have made them targets. They analyzed their phone records, their bank statements, and their social media activity. One by one, detectives sat in sterile offices, scrolling through years of family photos, vacation updates, and mundane daily posts. Initially, this line of inquiry yielded nothing. The victims had no obvious connections to each other online. They didn't belong to the same groups, follow the same pages, or interact in any way. Their digital footprints were as separate and distinct as their real-world lives. Another frustrating dead end in a case full of them. It was this exhaustive, almost hopeless review of their online presence that eventually led to the first significant break. A young, tech-savvy analyst on the task force, frustrated with the surface-level data, decided to request more detailed server logs from the social media platforms the victims had used. He wasn't just looking at their public posts. He wanted to see the back-end data, the invisible traffic of who was looking at them. The platforms were reluctant to provide such information, citing privacy concerns. But federal warrants eventually compelled them to cooperate. The data that came back was dense, technical, and required weeks of painstaking analysis. Deep within the logs, the analyst found it. It was a subtle but consistent pattern, hidden in the metadata. In the weeks leading up to each of their disappearances, every single victim's social media profile had experienced a sudden and significant spike in views from private or anonymized accounts. These were not public interactions. This was silent observation. Someone had been systematically and repeatedly visiting their pages, studying their photos, learning their friend networks, and mapping out their lives. The Shadow Collector wasn't just stalking his victims in the physical world. His hunt began long before, in the cold, detached realm of digital surveillance. He was a ghost in the machine long before he became a ghost on the streets. about where they disappeared. It was about why they were chosen. With Detective Carter now directing the investigation, the task force doubled down on the digital trail. The pattern of pre-attack surveillance was the first real behavioral clue they had. It painted a picture of a predator who was not impulsive but deeply patient, a voyeur who enjoyed the power of knowing his victims were completely unaware of his watchful eye. This invisible intrusion was his signature, a silent act of violation that preceded the physical one. The investigators began to operate under a new, terrifying assumption. The shadow collector was actively scouting his next target at that very moment, scrolling through social media profiles from a location that was, for now, completely hidden. The challenge was to find the source of these anonymous profile views. The social media companies could only tell them that the views came from accounts shielded by layers of proxies and virtual private networks, VPNs, technological tools designed to mask a user's true location and identity. The digital ghost had covered his tracks well, routing his connection through servers in different countries, making a direct trace seem impossible. For weeks, the task force's cybercrime unit tried to peel back these layers, hitting one technical wall after another. The killer's digital security was as formidable as his real-world planning. He was an expert in staying hidden. Carter, however, refused to accept that the trail was cold. He believed that even the most careful operator has a routine. He instructed his team to stop trying to trace the connection in real time, and instead look for patterns in the access logs over the entire 2-year period. He wanted to know the times of day the stalking occurred, the duration of the sessions, and whether the same anonymizing services were used each time. He was hunting for a habit, a subtle repetition that might betray the human behind the keyboard. It was a tedious, data-intensive task. A search for a needle in a global haystack of internet traffic. After weeks of cross-referencing terabytes of data, the analyst found it. While the killer used different IP addresses and proxy servers for each stalking session, he consistently used the same commercial VPN service. More importantly, he always seemed to connect through a specific server cluster located in Chicago. This narrowed the geographic area significantly, but the final piece of the puzzle was the timing. The stalking sessions almost always occurred late at night, between 10 p.m. and midnight, and they always disconnected a few minutes before midnight. This was the habit Carter had been looking for. The killer wasn't just disciplined, he was punctual. His invisible intrusion was tied to a schedule, and that schedule was the first real weakness he had ever shown. Detective Carter's theory that the killer had a routine proved to be the key that unlocked the next door. The task force now had a behavioral pattern, the use of a specific VPN service connecting through a Chicago server cluster, always late at night and always disconnecting just before midnight. It was a slender thread, but it was the first real one they had. Carter immediately had his cybercrime unit focus all their efforts on this single piece of information. They contacted the VPN provider, armed with a federal warrant, demanding access logs for any user connecting to that Chicago server cluster from within a 50-mile radius of Millstone, Illinois. They were no longer searching the globe. They were searching the killer's own backyard. The request was a legal and technical long shot. Most high-quality VPN services pride themselves on a no-logs policy, meaning they don't keep records of their users' activities. It's the primary selling point of their service. However, Carter was betting on a different kind of data. He didn't need to know the user was doing, only they were connecting. He needed metadata, connection timestamps, duration, and the originating Internet Service Provider, ISP. After days of legal wrangling, the VPN company complied, providing a massive dataset of anonymized connection records. The team's analysts now had to cross-reference these thousands of connections with the exact times of the known stalking sessions. The process was like listening for a specific heartbeat in a hurricane. For days, the analyst's keyboard clicked away in the quiet, tense atmosphere of the task force office. He wrote custom scripts to sift through the data, filtering by time and location. Finally, after another sleepless night, he found it. A single recurring signature. One account, paid for with a disposable cryptocurrency, consistently connected to the Chicago server at the precise times of the digital stalking. More importantly, the originating connection, though masked, could be traced back to a single public-facing IP address. It wasn't a residential address. It belonged to a small 24-hour internet cafe in a rundown strip mall on the outskirts of Millstone. The discovery sent a jolt of electricity through the entire task force. The Shadow Collector, this digital phantom who could dance through global servers, had made a critical error. He hadn't committed his digital intrusions from the safety of a private residence, which would have been nearly impossible to pinpoint. Instead, he had used a public space, likely believing the anonymity of a shared network would protect him. It was the arrogance Carter had predicted. The killer felt so secure in his technical prowess that he overlooked the simple, physical vulnerability of using a public terminal. He was not a ghost after all. He was a person who had to physically go somewhere to begin his hunt. He was a man in a hoodie, a faceless shape on a grainy recording. The breakthrough had led them to another wall, but this time, the wall had a human silhouette. For weeks, the task force was stuck. They had the footage of the man in the hoodie, but without a clear face or a license plate, there was little they could do. They ran the blurry images through facial recognition software with no matches. They sat on the internet cafe for days, hoping he would return, but the shadow collector was too cautious. After the police had requested the VPN logs, he had likely sensed the shift in the investigation and abandoned his routine. The trail had gone cold again, and the frustration within the task force was palpable. They were closer than ever, yet the suspect remained just out of reach, a shadow they could see but not touch. It felt like another dead end. Detective Carter refused to give up on the cafe. He believed the killer, despite his meticulous planning, was still human and therefore fallible. He ordered a full forensic sweep of the computer terminal the man in the hoodie always used. Crime scene technicians descended on the small internet cafe, dusting for prints and collecting fibers. They disassembled the entire workstation, from the keyboard and mouse to the computer tower itself. The cafe owner watched on, bewildered, as the team meticulously bagged every component. It was a desperate last-ditch effort, and most of the detectives, including Carter, expected to find nothing. The killer had been too careful. The initial findings from the forensic team were disappointing. As expected, the keyboard, mouse, and desk surface had been wiped clean. There were no usable prints, no hairs, no fibers, nothing to identify the user. But then, a junior technician, tasked with examining the keyboard itself, noticed something. Wedged deep between the G and H keys, almost completely hidden from view, was a small black object. It was a tiny USB flash drive, no bigger than a thumbnail, the kind that is easy to drop and even easier to lose. It must have slipped from the killer's grasp and fallen into the tight space between the keys, unseen. It was a minuscule mistake, a one-in-a-million accident. The